In this video, we'll learn how to use counters in your rules. There are a lot of different things that counters can be used for, from something as simple as counting a number of events to counting distances or time or elevation. There are two separate pieces for using counters. The first part is to actually create the counter. You can think of that like one of those tally counters that you've maybe seen used at an event. By default, it doesn't do anything, it's just a device used to count. You need somebody or something to tell it what to count and to actually make the counting happen. And the second part is using that counter in your rule, which is where you actually tell it what to do and how to do it so that it counts. To begin, the first thing we need to do is create a counter, which we can do by selecting My Counters from the menu. There's a lot of information at the top on different ways to use counters, which is what I'll cover in this video. The first thing that we need to do is give the counter a name. The name is just something for you to reference in your rule, and the only requirement is that each counter has a unique name. For this example, I'm going to create a counter to keep track of the number of ski days that I do each year, so I'll call it ski counter. The initial value is whatever I'd like it to be, and in this case, since I haven't skied yet this year, I'll leave it at 0. But if you were creating this in the middle of the season and you had already done some days, you could start it at whatever the current number is. The next field, increment counter by, is how much that counter will increment each time that it's used. So in this case, because I'm keeping track of a number of ski days, I just want it to increment by 1. But there are other options. For example, you can do distance or elevation or calories or any of the other options listed up here. And finally, I'm going to select when to reset this counter. The options here are weekly, monthly, yearly, or never. And in this case, since I'm tracking yearly ski days, I want yearly. And then I can select a reset date. I live in the northern hemisphere, so I'm definitely not going to be skiing in the summer. So I'm just going to choose June 1st, since it's very unlikely that I will ski any time after that. And so this way I'm keeping track of my count on a seasonal basis, which would include the winter starting at the end of the year and then continuing into the beginning of the next year. And finally, the counter reset value is when the counter resets, what do I want it to reset to? Once I'm happy with all of that, I can click Save Counter, and you can see that it's been created. In order to use that counter, I will now go create a rule. So I'll select Add Rule from the menu, and we'll call this rule Count Ski Days. For the update, I'm just going to add to the title, ski day, number, and then to insert the counter, I use 2 curly braces, and you can see that it pops up the option to select ski counter. So I'll select that, and what this will do is add that counter to the end of the title of my activity. For when it should be changed, since I'm keeping track of skiing, I will use activity type is. I'm selecting Nordic ski since that is the primary type of skiing that I want to keep track of. I will save that rule. I've gone ahead and run that rule on 2 of my activities. So if we click into activity processing history, you can see that I ran it on 2 different ski days, and the first one had ski day number 1, and the second had ski day number 2. And if I click to my counters in the menu, you can see that that counter has a current value of 2 instead of the initial value that I put in of 0. Now let's add 2 more counters. I'm going to use these to keep track of the amount of time and distance I've spent riding my bike indoors. We'll call the first counter indoor distance and start it at 0, and we'll increment it by distance. What that will do is every time the counter is used, it will increment by whatever the distance of that activity was. In this case, I will also reset yearly, but I will do it on January 1st, so that it keeps track for the current calendar year. I'll also create another one called indoor time, and this one I will increment by moving time. And everything else is the same as the other counter, it resets on January 1st. Now that I've created both of those, we'll go add a rule which uses them. We'll click on Add Rule from the menu. We'll call the rule Indoor Distance and Time, and what I'm going to do is add to my private notes. I'll say Indoor Distance, and then I will insert the counter for that. I'll use \n to insert a new line, and then I will do Indoor Time, and I will insert Time Counter. So you can use both counters, or rather, you can use more than one counter in a rule. And finally, for when it should be changed, since it is virtual activities, I will do virtual ride. I'm gone ahead and run that rule on one of my virtual activities, and if we click into my counters, you can now see that the indoor distance and indoor time have been updated to reflect that activity. You'll notice that there is a Show Advanced Options link here. If you select that, it adds a couple of additional options. The first one is maximum increments and a number of days. What you can do in this case, for example, if you had a counter that you only wanted to increment once a day, you could set that to one increment per one day. And if you were to record multiple activities that day, which all hit one of your rules, the counter would only increment for the first one, and the remaining ones would not change the counter. That might be useful if, for example, you had a counter to track the number of days that you've been active. You wouldn't want it to increment more than once a day, even if you recorded more than one activity. The other option that adds is the option to reset your counter every X number of days. This is useful for a case where, for example, Garmin has challenges that last for 30 calendar days, which doesn't cleanly line up with a number of weeks or months, and so you could use this to keep track of those activities. Next, I would like to talk about a couple of undocumented features with counters that you might find useful. So if we go to one of my existing rules, and we'll just use count ski days, right now, every time this rule matches, it will add my counter to the title. If instead I didn't want to display the counter anywhere, but I still wanted it to increment, what you can do is replace that with the normal counter, but then put a plus in front of it. What the plus will do is it will still increment the counter normally, but the counter will not be displayed anywhere. This is useful if you just want to keep track of something that you can go look at the value on the My Counters page, but you don't actually want to insert the value of that counter anywhere into your activity. The second option is the exact opposite of that. So if we go back to count ski days, if instead I put a question mark in front of this, it will display the counter, but it will not increment it. So this would be useful if you just wanted to show the current value of the count, but not actually increment it. One case where this might be useful is if, for example, you had rules like I do for counting indoor distance and time, and you also had rules for counting outdoor distance and time. Then on this one, which is matching only with virtual activities, if you still want to display the outdoor values as well, you could add those here, and you could put a question mark to not display the counter. And that way you could have this information on every activity, but it would only increment the counters that are relevant to that activity. That is how you use counters in your rules. If you have any other questions, please let me know in the comments.